The Pentagon says it was a military command and control center.
This was a legitimate military target, and it was struck as it was planned and as it was targeted.
The Iraqis insist it was a civilian shelter.
I don't know why they hit children and...
But what if it was both? When the lines between civilian and military targets are blurred during war, we'll examine that painful dilemma tonight.
This is ABC News Nightline. Reporting from Washington with the latest on the Gulf War, Ted Koppel.
Today, as the Gulf War entered its second month, what has seemed all too often a remote and bloodless battle took on a ghastly human face. There is no reason to doubt the word of U.S. military commanders who insist that what was bombed in Baghdad today was an Iraqi command and control center. But the evidence is also overwhelming that hundreds of men, women, and children had taken shelter in that building, and most of them were killed. Sometimes in war, civilians are targeted intentionally. The Germans did that during the Second World War when they aimed their V-1 and V-2 rockets at London, and then when the Luftwaffe bombed Coventry. And by grim coincidence, it was on this day, 46 years ago, that more than 35,000 Germans died as the result of Allied bombing raids against Dresden. But in this war, the United States and its coalition partners insist that they are doing everything humanly possible to avoid civilian casualties. What still remains unanswered, however, is what will happen if Saddam Hussein deliberately insulates his remaining strategic targets by placing them in the midst of civilian centers, or by sheltering civilians at military targets, as may have been the case today. We begin with this report from Nightline correspondent Jeff Greenfield.
From a military point of view, nothing went wrong. The target was struck as designated.
4 weeks after the Gulf War began, the United States came face to face with the real face of war. Not the images of pinpoint hits on buildings and bridges, not the high-tech wonders of weapons that blow up only buildings, but the deaths of hundreds of civilians in the capital of the adversary. They died in a building bombed by American planes, a building described by Allied forces as a clear-cut military target, claimed by Baghdad as a civilian bomb shelter.
A lot of children. Many women.
It was the kind of horror that sent Allied spokesmen into a day-long effort to explain what had happened and to put responsibility for the dead and injured squarely back on Saddam Hussein. This morning, at the military briefing in Riyadh.
In fact, it was a command and control bunker. I can't explain if there were civilians in there, why they were in there.
U.S. military officials here in Riyadh fended off inquiries all day long until the regular briefing. On camera and off, they took a hard line. They had radio transmissions and photos, they said, showing that the Baghdad bunker was a legitimate military target.
At the White House, where the normal rules were suspended to permit on-camera coverage of Press Secretary Marlin Fitzwater.
That Saddam Hussein does not share our value in the sanctity of life. Indeed, he time and again has shown a willingness to sacrifice civilian lives and property that further his war aims.
One idea that was considered was the release of the satellite information upon which the decision to bomb that facility was made. However, the CIA, as it has in the past, vetoed that idea.
In a speech by Defense Secretary Richard Cheney.
There is in Iraq a city called spelled U-R. It's a city of significant archaeological interest. Satellite imagery obtained just this morning indicates that there are now 2 MiG-21s, combat aircraft of the Iraqi Air Force, parked right next to the pyramid.
At a Pentagon briefing this afternoon.
The fact that it has a camouflage roof, the fact that it has a security fence around it with barbed wire.
Everything that we're seeing relative to this facility is coming out of a controlled press in Baghdad.
So the game of damage control became one of expressing the right tone over the deaths of civilians while suggesting that Saddam Hussein had no grounds to complain because of his own Scud attacks against civilians, suggesting maybe even that he had put Iraqis in danger by situating them at a military facility.
In Great Britain today, news of the bombing spurred criticism among some opposition Labourites.
Is it not clear there is a growing revulsion, not only among the Arab nations, but throughout the world at what is happening in Iraq?
In Jordan, which tonight declared 3 days of mourning for the dead, the bombing intensified feelings already present.
After following this war for 4 weeks in their own newspapers, a lot of people believe the U.S. is not only hitting civilians, but is deliberately hitting civilians. Few people, in any case, believe that the carnage in this war only started today.
In Moscow, a group of Communist Party leaders within the Soviet military bitterly denounced U.S. policy in the Gulf, claiming its real purpose was to kill Iraqi civilians. And on Soviet TV, there was this skeptical assessment of what had happened.
The war is actually one-sided since Iraq is virtually defenseless against the American and Allied Air Force. There are very few untouched military targets left in Iraq, and that's why the civilian population is increasingly becoming the real victim.
At the United Nations, the Security Council voted to hold a closed-door debate to discuss the war in the Gulf. And on British TV, one military expert declared that the mingling of civilians with the military was a recurring fact of Iraqi life.
The Iraqis apparently constructed over the last 10 years a vast network of large shelters of 2 stories, one above ground, or partially above ground, and the other below ground. The idea is the portion above ground would be used as an air raid shelter either for military or civilians, and the portion underneath as a command and control center.
Back in the United States, most people we asked, not all but most, saw the deaths as an inevitable fact of warfare, and they knew who they held responsible.
Whenever you have war, there's always going to be casualties. If they're going to hide behind kids or women and children or whatever, they should suffer the consequences.
They claim that they hit the bunker for military reasons, but it's very questionable.
Well, anytime you have a war situation as it is right now, unfortunately, civilian casualty is going to happen.
Ironically, it was a general who was one of the few Americans today to raise the moral issue.
The fact is that it looks like civilians were hurt here. We're going to examine our consciences very closely to determine if we can't do something in the future to preclude that. Obviously, we didn't know that the civilians were in there, or we would not have bombed the thing.
Should the United States stay its hand if Iraqi civilians are used to shield military targets? Are there some targets that are just not worth the cost of civilian lives? And will this tragedy change public opinion here, or among the Allies, or in the Third World? Tonight, there are some very hard questions to answer. Jeff Greenfield for Nightline in New York.
When we return, the dilemma of how to deal with military targets placed near civilians. We'll talk with ABC correspondent Bill Blakemore live from Baghdad. He toured the bomb shelter earlier today. And with Admiral William Crowe, the former chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff. And later in our broadcast, we'll talk with Vitaly Churkin, the chief spokesman for the Soviet Foreign Ministry, about his country's diplomatic mission to Iraq.
This is ABC News Nightline, brought to you by Ford.
Know our assignment and go out and do it with some aggressiveness.
Why is it that some people constantly manage to reach heights others can only dream of? A few towns in western Pennsylvania have produced more football legends than any other place.
We play with poison.
Dan Marino.
We know at the end of this game.
Johnny Unitas. George Blanda. What is it about these towns that gives birth to such greatness? Fierce pride, tradition, an obsession with excellence, the very things that drive us at Ford. When leadership is in your blood, you push yourself to greater and greater heights. Our 1991 four-door Explorer and Escort have recorded the highest customer satisfaction ratings in our history. And starting right now, you'll be seeing more new models and exciting innovation from Ford and Lincoln Mercury than you've seen in years. America fell in love with Ford in the 80s, and we're going to be even tougher to beat in the 90s. Ford Motor Company.
When it comes to sports cars, no one moves you in more ways than your Toyota dealer.
We know.
In fact, Celica GTS has been called the beginning of a new era.
I can see that.
And did you know Supra gets raves for its power and style?
I know.
And Road and Track magazine says the MR2 resembles a scaled-down Ferrari.
And it performs like one, too.
So with all the great deals,
you just can't beat a Toyota.
The more you know, the more likely you'll buy a Toyota. See your dealer today.
On October 27, 1986, the biggest trade in the history of the London Stock Exchange took place. They traded in their way of doing business. What's most interesting is the computerized system they chose to replace it with. One stock market in America has already used for 2 decades.
With anti-American feelings on the rise in Jordan, Diane Sawyer is there to interview King Hussein and his American-born wife on Prime Time, Thursday.
Joining us now live from Baghdad is ABC's Bill Blakemore, who toured that bombed air raid shelter earlier today. And here in our Washington Bureau, Admiral William Crowe, former chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff and a consultant to ABC News. Bill, are you satisfied when you went out to that shelter, which, as you've heard, the U.S. command is describing as a command and control center, that you were able to see all parts of it?
Oh, of course not. We could only go down to the first upper level of it before the heat and the smoke stopped us. And when I asked suddenly at the end of the day to go back there again, which the official said, sure, go ahead and do it, it was still burning. They were still bringing people out, and the people bringing the bodies out of what were very clearly women and children were wearing firemen's gas masks. So it wasn't possible to get down into it yet.
But from what you have heard, and I know you've been hearing the reports back in Baghdad of what is being said here by the High Command of the Pentagon, what is your reaction to what you have heard? For example, they say camouflaged roof. You and I spoke earlier. You said you were up on the roof.
Yes, we were up on the roof. I certainly didn't notice anything like that. It seemed to be a normal gravel roof, a bit of rubble around on it, but I didn't see any camouflage on it. Maybe all I can say is I didn't see any.
What about this notion of housing civilians in what may very well have been a military target? Have you been able to talk to any Iraqi officials, and what has been their response?
We spoke with a number of Iraqi officials, and I also spoke with a number of the neighborhood officials around there, including the community leader who was appointed the head of the shelter. They all said that there was absolutely no military personnel or military activity connected with the shelter in any way. We spoke with many of the civilians who were standing around waiting for bad news from inside, and they told us, a number of them in different ways, that this is where their wives and their children went every night. We've been told that no men, except for extremely old men, were allowed in the shelter. And from everything we could gather from the people who lived in the neighborhood, since the war began, the women and children had been going there. Sometimes the women said or the men said that their wives said they were taking the children there just so they could sleep under the loud bombardment.
Admiral Crowe, a couple of years ago, when that Iranian Airbus was shot down, you personally experienced how wrong initial information can be. I remember you were briefing at the Pentagon in those days, and I'm sure in good faith were telling everyone that you thought that was a military aircraft, or at least that the aircraft was on a military mission. Is it possible that the U.S. military at this point could be so badly misinformed about that target?
In war, of course, Ted, with all the uncertainties attendant upon it, it's always possible to make a mistake. But from what I've heard today, and I followed it very closely, they certainly had considerable evidence that it was an active command and control center, and that it was active in the operations in the direction of the Iraqi war effort.
Sketch out for us, because most of us as civilians really have no real notion of what a command and control center is. What does that mean?
It normally implies offices for commanders with all the communications and staff that go with them. And I'm talking about elaborate communications, both land wires and radio, and contact with a number of units, a number of different offices where information both comes in and goes out to the active forces, field forces.
Is there any reason to believe that it would be visibly identifiable as that from the outside?
Well, they would try very hard to make it not visible or not to look like a command and control center. That's difficult with communications gear sometimes, but they would not make it obvious. No, not if they could avoid it.
So on what basis do you think U.S. intelligence would know that this was the building? I mean, I'm sure there are radio intercepts and things like that, but again, perhaps you can explain it to us a little more closely.
Well, as I understand it, and I'm not privy to all the information they have, but in the early 80s, before the war ever started, when we had a lot of human intelligence coming out of Baghdad, they converted the air raid shelter, at least it was our impression, and our information that it had been converted to a control center. Now, in this crisis, it evidently became what they call active just within the last few days, and active means that it was taking a communications role in military operations.
Bill Blakemore, I'm sure that you have raised the question with Iraqis, if not there today, then on other days. whether they would use what is essentially a civilian building for military purposes. And what do they tell you?
They tell us no, they would not.
Now, I should tell you, and this may not come as any great comfort to you, but in tomorrow morning's New York Times, they point out that one of the last major command and control centers is actually in a secret basement of the hotel in which you're staying, and indeed from which you are talking to us right now, the Al Rashid.
That would surprise me a great deal. There are 35 journalists from around the world here. In fact, the Russian envoy stayed here 2 nights ago when he was here, and we would be very sensitive to that fact if it were true, because, of course, all of the communications equipment bringing the news that we can get out of this war is coming from here. We go down into the basement shelter constantly to find people when we have to talk about the details with putting out the news here. Sometimes people are downstairs, sometimes they're in the lobby. We have seen absolutely nothing in the grounds around this hotel and nothing down in the shelters, which we walk through quite freely, as far as we can tell, that looks in any way military. That's all I can tell you.
Well, I should tell you also, the good news is that the Times reports that the command structure here in Washington has also ordered that the Rashid not be bombed, certainly at least for the time being. Let me raise with you, Admiral Crowe, for a moment, the question now of what would be U.S. policy, or what do you think U.S. policy would be in the event that it became clear that Saddam Hussein was deliberately either placing civilians at strategic military sites or taking strategic military targets and putting them right in the middle of a civilian center?
Obviously, it poses a very difficult dilemma, Ted. Now, we know for a fact that the main active command and control centers at the beginning of the war and in peacetime, they've been damaged, and they are moving to other places and are moving many operations and functions and facilities into civilian neighborhoods. So it's a dilemma that is upon us, and it makes our choices and some of our decisions very difficult.
Early on, before the war started, last fall, in fact, when the human shields, the Americans and other nationalities, were distributed to strategic sites, President Bush, of course, made it quite clear that that would not in any way deflect him from ordering those targets hit if they had to be hit. Now, can we therefore assume that the same kind of orders would be given if Iraqi civilians were placed in those locations?
I don't know if you can assume that, but you can assume if it's a significant military target and really stands or is capable of damaging us, that yes, I think it would stay on our target list. But this question you're asking is more than a military question. It has a high political content, particularly given the vibrations that we're going to see in the Arab world and also among our coalition partners. And it will pose some very difficult political decisions.
Bill Blakemore, a last quick question to you. Are you going to be permitted to go back to that shelter again once the fire is out to examine that building?
I hope so. We're certainly asking to do that. It's just dawn here, so we don't know yet, but we're going to be asking to do that.
What kind of a night has it been as far as the air raids are concerned?
There was a little bit of bombing. The general impression from our crew here is that we slept better than usual and that the bombing wasn't as heavy last night as it has been in the previous ones.
All right. Bill Blakemore, Admiral Crowe, thank you both very much. A Soviet envoy returned to Moscow today after meeting Saddam Hussein in Baghdad, and he talked about possible peace feelers from Iraq. When we come back, we'll examine that issue with the chief spokesman for the Soviet Foreign Ministry.
Recently, DuPont announced that its energy unit would pioneer the use of new double-hulled oil tankers in order to safeguard the environment. The response has been overwhelmingly positive. DuPont, better things for better living.
Every business morning, while the rest of the world is getting up. UPS is guaranteeing overnight delivery before 10:30 to the most people, places, and businesses for up to half what other companies charge. And every business morning, more people are waking up to that fact.
Good morning.
Morning.
Ready?
Okay.
When you own a car, you expect to pay for things like...
Oil changes.
Good, and?
Windshield. A wiper blade.
Right, but with your Ford dealer's California Car Care warranty, you pay...
Nothing. Really?
Really, it covers the entire car, parts and labor for...
2 years or 24,000 miles?
Mm-hmm. So virtually all you pay for is...
Gas? Wow.
And it's all yours at no extra charge.
Hey, that's me.
Just buy or lease any new 91 Escort Pro or Tempo, but you better hurry because this offer ends soon. See your Ford dealer today.
See for yourself.
Now during Macy's Home Sale and Show, our super stain-resistant carpet is only $19.99 a square yard installed. Fill your room with an 8x11 machine-made rug for just $1.99. Handmade 9x12 rugs start at just $7.99. Find out about Macy's deferred billing plan. You'll save on an unsurpassed collection of fine furniture, floor coverings, and electronics during the big Home Sale and Show now at Macy's.
If money were no object, what would you want in a car?
Guts. Muscle.
Just looks beautiful.
You know,
Slick.
sleek, something a little bit different.
4 doors.
I can't drive.
Luxury.
Style. All the comforts of home.
Everything.
Well, money is an object, which is why we created the all-new Nissan Sentra, recently selected by Road and Track as the best sedan under $10,000. Nissan, it's more than a car. It's an attitude.
Right.
Aircraft carriers, amphibious assaults, naval operations vital to the Gulf War. Sam Donaldson with the man in charge of it all on Primetime Thursday.
Tomorrow we'll keep you up to date on the Gulf War.
Also a Valentine's reunion with loved ones left behind.
And on Friday, Caroline Kennedy on Good Morning America.
Joining us live now from Moscow to explain his country's mission to Iraq is Vitaly Churkin, the chief spokesman for the Soviet Foreign Ministry. Before we get to the Primakov mission, Mr. Churkin, the reaction in Moscow today within government circles about the bombing in Baghdad earlier today.
Well, the day is only starting here, Ted, but I expect there is going to be considerable uneasiness in the press and in the population about what has happened there. There has been a lot of criticism voiced of our government's position in this crisis in support of the Allied effort. So I would expect that it will increase the pressure on the government to do something in order to see the hostilities stopped in the Persian Gulf.
Is there any uneasiness within the government now about the position that it has taken in association with the Allies?
No, we remain to be committed to the UN Security Council resolutions, but there is a concern that there is a certain threat of the things in the Persian Gulf going beyond the framework of the UN Security Council resolutions.
Yevgeny Primakov returned to Moscow yesterday, your time. I gather he has already met with President Gorbachev. Is there any reason to believe that Saddam Hussein has softened his position on withdrawing from Kuwait?
Mr. Primakov seems to be very, very cautiously optimistic about the prospect, optimistic enough to suggest that it might be worthwhile to receive Tariq Aziz here in Moscow. As you know, he's going to come here on Sunday and talk to Gorbachev and Besmertnych on Monday.
When you say optimistic about the possibility that the Iraqis might withdraw unconditionally from Kuwait?
Optimistic, very cautiously, I say, about a possibility of some movement on the part of the Iraqis, and hopefully, I would like to emphasize, a change in their very rigid position, which would make it possible to implement the UN Security Council resolutions.
That change of the rigid position, as you know, the UN Security Council takes, or the resolutions collectively take a rather tough position themselves, in that they require a complete and unconditional withdrawal from Kuwait and the restoration of Kuwait's legitimate government. What is it, from what you are able to tell us, that Mr. Primakov brings back that causes him to believe that the Iraqis may be changing their position on those 2 points?
Well, I cannot describe in detail what Mr. Primakov talked to Saddam Hussein about in Baghdad, but first, we were talking only about the implementation of the UN Security Council resolutions, and second, as you know, in diplomacy, there are some things which come in addition to the words which are being said. So I guess there was something which Mr. Primakov observed in Baghdad, and a factor was also the willingness of the Iraqis to dispatch Tariq Aziz to Moscow that made him very, very cautiously optimistic that there was some kind of a promise of the Iraqis changing their position.
There is only so much, of course, that the Soviet Union can do with regard to carrying these negotiations forward, at which point would the United States have to become involved?
Well, the sooner the better, and we, of course, are going to keep the United States informed of the process of our talks with the Iraqis, but it's important to elicit some kind of positive movement on their part, first of all. But we are certainly not against the United States' involvement in the negotiating process if there is a chance of success, and when the United States deems it necessary to join the process.
What can you share with us, Mr. Churkin, about Mr. Primakov's impressions of the atmospherics in Baghdad these days? And I'm talking also about the mental attitude of Saddam Hussein.
Nothing.
Because?
We are still in the process of talking with the Iraqis, and Commissioner Primakov has not authorized me to make any statements.
He didn't come back with any impressions that, that he's willing to share with the rest of the world at this point, then?
That is my impression, yes.
If you were a betting man, and I don't know whether you are or not, you think we are any closer to peace tonight than we were before Mr. Primakov went to Baghdad?
I'm not a betting man, but we're in a slightly better position diplomatically, I think, because there is an indication of the possibility of resumption of dialogue. And our channels of communication with the Iraqis are open, and we are hopeful for the next round of talks with the Tariq Aziz. Though, again, there is not much solid ground for hope.
Mr. Churkin, I thank you very much. I know it's early in the morning in Moscow. Good of you to join us.
Thank you.
I'll be back in a moment.
Fact. Right now, your Ford dealer can offer you dealer incentives and option packages that can save you thousands. Fact. Savings on the best-built, best-selling American cars and trucks. Call it leadership. Call it winning. Call it anything you want. The simple fact is, Ford is #1. Get all the facts and all the savings during Leadership Month at your Ford dealer now.
Did you know if you're not using the AT&T network, your company waits over 40% longer for long-distance calls to connect?
I'm gonna wait till the midnight hour when there's no one else around. I'm gonna wait till the midnight hour.
Without AT&T, in 1 year you may end up paying people thousands of dollars to wait.
I'm gonna wait till the
Faster connections, another AT&T advantage.
I go to LensCrafters because with my job, glasses in an hour are not just a convenience, they're a must.
LensCrafters puts the whole lab right in the store to custom craft your top quality glasses in about an hour. Call LensCrafters at 1-800-522-LENS.
You're going to be knocked over by Tartar Control Aquafresh. It reduces ugly tartar and more. It helps remove plaque and fights cavities with fluoride, with taste that knocks over the leading brand. For a great deal more, get Tartar Control Aquafresh.
Of the minivan is now complete.
Tomorrow on Primetime Live, Diane Sawyer talks with King Hussein of Jordan and with his wife, Queen Noor, amidst a rising tide of anti-American sentiment in Jordan. And Sam Donaldson reports from the Gulf on preparations for an amphibious assault. That's our report for tonight. I'm Ted Koppel in Washington. For all of us here at ABC News, good night.
Combat zone. The U.S. High Command insists they have avoided bombing certain targets for fear of hitting civilians. They say they are considering warning Iraqi people before bombing cities. But there's been no let-up in the air war. The focus is now on Iraqi supply lines and troop concentrations. And also 2 American airmen were killed when their EF-111A jet crashed during a combat mission. So far, 27 U.S. warplanes have been lost. And still, no exact death toll from yesterday's bombing in Baghdad. Rescue workers there pulled more bodies from the rubble today. So far, 64 have been dug out. The U.S. says the building was a military command post, but Iraq claims it was a civilian air raid shelter. Some in the West have speculated that Saddam Hussein purposely put civilians there. The first of the victims was buried today, and the mourners vowed to punish President Bush for shedding innocent blood. Reaction throughout the Arab world is growing with more anger every day. Doug Tennell reports from Amman, Jordan, on reaction there.
Outside the U.S. Embassy in Amman this morning, a small but angry crowd.
Get out! We'll kill you! Come on! Out!
For these demonstrators, there is no question that the shelter in Baghdad was not a legitimate military target. No question, they say, that the United States is intentionally attacking Iraqi civilians. Today, America was the target of their fury.
They are not military installations, they are human beings! Children, women, all people! Is this what you call democracy? Is this what you call United Nations resolution?
The casualty toll is still not final. Iraqis are still searching for their loved ones and still mourning those they know are dead. And Jordan isn't the only place where people were outraged. The Tunisian government branded the bombing a savage attack. The official Algerian news agency called it a massacre.
They've hid behind their technology, they've hid behind their precision bombing, and they've completely ruled out the question of human morality.
In Jordan this morning, flags were at half-staff. The government has declared this the first of 3 days of mourning for the victims of the Baghdad bunker. In Amman, people have put up flags of mourning for Iraqis in Baghdad. Doug Tennell, CBS News, Amman.
It's a delicate balancing act. Allied bombing of strategic targets does put civilians at risk, but the more of those targets are taken out now, that means fewer American combat casualties later on. The man in charge of the U.S. war effort in the Gulf visited with his troops in the field today. Asked about yesterday's hit in Baghdad, General Norman Schwarzkopf didn't pull any punches.
We are not indiscriminately targeting civilian targets, and I think that the very action of the Iraqis themselves demonstrate that they know damn well that we're not attacking civilian targets. Since right now they've dispersed their airplanes into residential areas, they've moved their headquarters into schools, they've moved their headquarters into hotel buildings, they put guns and things like that on top of high-rise apartment buildings. Under the Geneva Convention, that gives us a perfect right to go after those things if we wanted to, and we haven't done it. And they know damn well we're not targeting civilian targets, even though they're trying to make something out of it. Just look at what they've done on the ground, and that should tell you that they know we're not doing it.
Reporters pressed the general for information on when the ground campaign might begin, and as usual, he didn't say. The Allies charge that Saddam Hussein has used everything from schools to mosques to shelter his military equipment. Well, today there is a new accusation. The U.S. claims that there is a key military communications center in the basement of the Al Rashid Hotel in Baghdad. Many of the foreign diplomats and journalists in Baghdad stay at that hotel. Well, today the hotel's manager escorted a group of journalists around the building to show them that there was no command center there. Pentagon officials say no airstrikes are planned for the hotel. Straight ahead on
Channel 7 News. Good evening. I'm Richard Brown.
And I'm Ana Chavez. Federal officials are warning Californians to brace for new aerial targets in Iraq tonight, unimpeded by the international furor over the Baghdad bunker tragedy. The UN Security Council, meanwhile, has adjourned its closed-door discussions on the matter for tonight and will resume in the morning.
It was a good and serious meeting. There was only one important question. It was asked by a number of delegations of the Iraqis, when are we going to hear from your government about the withdrawal? I think that characterizes the meeting as best I can. A lot of other talk, but it was, I think, a valuable and useful opportunity to explore all those issues in depth.
Well, we believe that what's going on right now has nothing to do really with the Gulf crisis. It is simply an aggressive war by the United States and its allies against Iraq. The objective of this war is not to solve the Gulf crisis as much as to try to destroy the economic and military power of Iraq and to reduce it to a second-rate state rather than a viable and powerful regional power.
A transcript of tonight's Security Council meeting will not be released until tomorrow. The debate is expected to last for several days. Richard?
Tomorrow's edition of the British newspaper, The Independent, is quoting a senior U.S. military source saying the Baghdad shelter was bombed because the U.S. believed Iraqi military officers were inside. The source, who spoke on condition of anonymity, says that no one believed it was a command and control center, but that the military did believe it contained soldiers. The Pentagon's night duty officer tonight denied the story. Reporters who toured the site today said they saw no signs of military purpose, and that led to doubts in Jordan.
Here is a country that for decades has been a friend of the United States. What does it have to show for it? And the anger is basically leveled at ourselves. What has our moderation bought us? This is the feeling. How can we justify this relationship?
3 Western television crews were attacked in the course of a demonstration outside the U.S. Embassy in Amman today, but police said there were no serious injuries and no arrests.
Prince, located in Emporium department stores.
4 great heroes in Golden Gate Field's history come to life this holiday Monday, President's Day. Newark in his world record win in an epic duel with the legendary Citation. Native Diver with jockey Bill Shoemaker and the immortal John Henry, setting a new course record that still stands. All the action captured on a set of 4 12-ounce glasses, and they're yours free. This holiday Monday at Golden Gate Field and live via simulcast at Bay Meadows and the fairgrounds in Pleasanton and Vallejo. First race at 12:30 p.m.
Are we tapped out? Friday after Nightline on Channel 7.
One day after the bunker bombing in Baghdad, 2 views emerged. At home, some see it as a normal, if tragic, consequence of war. But abroad, anti-American feelings fester over what's seen as U.S. excess. We'll have the latest on the Gulf War, and we'll be joined live by the Iraqi ambassador to the UN tonight.
This is ABC News Nightline. Reporting from Washington with the latest on the Gulf War, Ted Koppel.
If there is still a certain level of preoccupation on the part of U.S. war planners with the civilian casualties caused by the bombing of that bunker yesterday in Baghdad, there was also a sense today that the next phase in the war is not far off. U.S. officials disclosed bomb damage assessment figures today from the Kuwaiti theater of operations. And those numbers suggest that things are nearly ready for the land war to begin. Nearly a third of all Iraqi tanks in Kuwait are said to have been destroyed, as are more than a third of the Iraqi artillery pieces and nearly a quarter of the armored personnel carriers. Uncounted and therefore unspoken, the number of Iraqi soldiers killed or wounded by the continual air bombardment. But the numbers that are claimed clearly define what the military has been referring to as the softening up process. The Iraqis today continued to fight back with one of the few effective weapons left at their disposal, the visual evidence of their own civilian losses. Here's Nightline correspondent Jeff Greenfield.
The Iraqi government brought Western reporters back today, back to the building that had become the center of the biggest fight to date on the battleground of public opinion. It was, Iraq claimed, a civilian bomb shelter where at least 288 people, mostly women and children, had died under an American bombing attack.
Liberating Kuwait does not mean destroying, does not require destroying Baghdad. Our revenge will be 1,000 Americans for every single Iraqi people.
Iraq's information minister drew a bitter comparison.
We have been told that Hitler banned Jews. We have been hearing this from you. Now Bush bans the children of Iraq.
From the commander of Allied forces in the Gulf came this angry rejoinder.
We are not indiscriminately targeting civilian targets, and I think that the very action of the Iraqis themselves demonstrate that they know damn well that we're not attacking civilian targets.
And this from today's Washington briefing.
This is a military facility. This is not a bomb shelter. What logical reason in the world would you have to put a large number of civilians into a functioning command and control center?
The Iraqis permitted reporters to wander all over the shelter today, including down to the lower level. They also permitted the press to tour the Al Rashid Hotel. The New York Times today had cited Pentagon sources who said the hotel held an underground military communications center. In neither place was any visible evidence found of military use, although it is hard to imagine that such a facility would be very easy to stumble across.
After a while, we saw that there was nothing that we as journalists, who are not military experts, could do. They told us there was nothing below the sub-basement. More than that, I really can't say.
From the Pentagon today came a restatement that targets would probably not be hit if there were civilians present, but
what we can't do is let Iraq stop us from pursuing this war by using civilians as shields. We will make every effort not to injure civilians. We will make every effort to attack military targets.
The shelter bombing accentuated a trend line already evident. The U.S. is simply running out of targets to hit in Baghdad and other urban centers. What it's doing now is concentrating on the battlefield, the Kuwait theater, hitting Republican Guard units, armored units. Right now, almost all the bombing is in preparation for the ground war.
From another front in the public opinion war, a Kuwaiti Air Force colonel in Saudi Arabia offered videotape from the Kuwaiti resistance and also offered a grim statistic designed to remind the world of Iraq's behavior.
There were 65 Kuwaiti men and women who have been executed by the Iraqis for subversion. 12 of those who had their throats cut and their heads removed from their bodies.
In Jordan, the anger was clearly directed at the United States. A demonstration in front of the U.S. Embassy was amplified by a prominent Jordanian journalist.
It certainly was the biggest single jump in emotional anger and bitterness against the United States, definitely up to now. And this is not a simple war about Kuwait. This is a much broader war that, from our perspective, about the Americans and the Israelis trying to maintain the political subjugation of the Arabs and the Muslims of this region.
Iran's foreign minister, who left for talks in Moscow today, accused the coalition of similar goals.
The situation in the Persian Gulf is getting out of hand.
His trip was part of a swarm of diplomatic moves. Tariq Aziz, Iraq's foreign minister, is due in Moscow for talks this weekend. And foreign ministers from at least 3 European nations are expected in Moscow at the same time. There's a possibility that the diplomatic world sees all this as a last chance to avoid the start of a ground war, a conflict very much on the mind of the UN Security Council, which met today in closed session for the first time since 1975 to debate the Gulf War.
If Saddam Hussein suddenly decides he wants to stop this war, calling for a ceasefire, U.S. officials believe that the Iranians or the Soviets might be a place he would turn to. Does the U.S. think this is now happening in this current flurry of diplomatic activity? The answer is no.
There is much talk now that a ground war is imminent. There's no moon in the sky, the Islamic holy month of Ramadan begins in March, and soon the weather will turn hot. Of course, there was also much talk 2 months ago that there would be no war at all, that a deal with Saddam Hussein had already been cut. So the one certainty that can be reported with absolute confidence is the same one that all wars, just and unjust, necessary and purposeless, carry with them. A lot of innocent people will die. Jeff Greenfield for Nightline in New York.
When we return, the Iraqi ambassador to the UN, Abdulamir Al-Anbari, who attended today's closed meeting of the Security Council. And later in our broadcast, we'll hear the views of a member of the Senate Foreign Relations Committee, Christopher Dodd of Connecticut, and former Navy fighter pilot, Senator John McCain of Arizona.
This is ABC News Nightline, brought to you by Jeep Eagle.
This good boy shares what he has with the rest of his class. This bad boy doesn't. There's only one Jeep Cherokee Sport.
Save $700 on new 1991 Jeep Cherokees.
Next time you're dining out, we invite you to try something startling. Something that won't cost a thing. Just pick up a packet of Equal. There, the blue one, and taste. We think you'll be so surprised by the great taste of the one with NutraSweet. You'll want to buy a box of Equal for the next time you're dining in.
Wow!
wow, these great dresses aren't $90, they're only $24. And these shirts and sweaters only $9.90 each. Where? At Burlington Coat Factory during their biggest ever Washington's birthday sale. You'll find great buys at giveaway prices. Zip-line raincoats, not $150, not $100, only $49.90. Men's leather-trimmed denim jackets, not $95, only $29.90. Plus drastic markdowns on ladies' fall sportswear and lots more. But only through Monday and only at Burlington Coat Factory.
All this and the quality of the mercury.
This man neglected to put his child in a safety seat and she was killed. Prosecutors say it's vehicular homicide. Should he go to jail or has he suffered enough? 2020, Friday.
Joining us live now from New York is Abdul Amir Al-Anbari, Iraq's permanent representative to the United Nations and the highest-ranking Iraqi diplomat currently in the United States. Mr. Ambassador, did you get the sense at today's closed meeting of the Security Council that there has been any softening in anybody's positions on either side? That the coalition is any weaker than it was when it passed the sundry UN Security Council resolutions against Iraq?
Well, by all means, Ted, but may I, with your permission, address myself first for a few seconds about this controversy concerning this massacre in the civilian shelters.
With your permission, Mr. Ambassador, can we get to that in due time? And we
all
will.
Right. If you give me a chance for that, I will...
absolutely. We will be talking
No,
about
actually,
that.
I did not sense any weakening of the so-called coalition simply because, actually, it is no genuine coalition. It is simply the United States of America leading quite a number of its allies. Some of them are just so-called passport in order to give it legitimacy or international character. However, I have to say that almost all, with perhaps exception of one or two, express their deep regrets and sorrow for the civilian casualties of the wars in recent days.
The reason I ask the question is it seems clear that one of the reasons for calling this Security Council meeting into session is that some nations clearly feel that perhaps the coalition forces are exceeding the mandate of the United Nations. And I'm wondering, is the purpose here to pass a new resolution of some kind? And if so, what can you tell us about it?
Well, first, let's realize that the call for this meeting was made by some member countries of the Security Council and Maghreb countries as well as other countries 3 weeks ago. But thanks to the manipulation of some permanent members, including the United States, they managed to postpone it and postpone it and postpone it, and eventually they forced their position to have it a closed meeting. That is, mass media and the world opinion and the public sort of information center would be precluded.
Well, if I may, because we have a relatively short period of time, Mr. Ambassador, perhaps we could cut to the chase.
Well, I'm sorry, then I came to
what...
your office if it's just for short minutes.
Sir?
You remember when we met once in Washington?
Yes.
I mean, I don't come to your office just for a second or two.
No, and I'm not asking you to do it in a second or two. I'm just asking you to at least address the question. And the question was...
So what I'm doing?
Whether there is... No, you were giving me a little dialogue there, or a little monologue there on your view of how this meeting came to pass.
I'm not going to express your view or American view, my view.
I understand what your view is, Mr. Ambassador, but I'm asking you questions, and I would appreciate the courtesy of a response to the question, not a speech on your part.
Okay.
The question was whether or not you feel that there is an effort now to get some other resolution passed, and what you feel the chances of such a resolution being passed.
I think there are some attempts on some people who would like to see eventual peaceful settlement. However, knowing that the U.S. and some of its allies have veto power, I don't think there is any real chance for that. The United States has shut down every diplomatic, every peaceful initiative from August 2nd until now. So I don't expect that any attempt, unless they would like to show how belligerent the United States is, would succeed as long as the U.S. has a veto power.
In that case, let's turn to an area where the United States presumably has no veto power, and that is in Moscow, where your foreign minister is headed, and where indeed 3 of the ministers from the European Economic Council are also headed. What chances do you believe that meeting has of producing any kind of a negotiated settlement?
I hope they would lead to some negotiated settlement, because this is what we have been after from the very beginning of the crisis. We have been emphasizing that we are interested in dialogue, but the other side saying no negotiation, no discussion, no etc., etc. However, I really don't hold much hope, because of the American stand. The United States is after Iraq, period.
Well, you are quite right if what you mean by that is that the United States has made it clear that it is going to require as a precondition the withdrawal of Iraqi troops from Kuwait. So my question to you, sir, is there any chance, you think, of Mr. Tariq Aziz going to Moscow and agreeing to an unconditional withdrawal of troops from Kuwait?
We never accept, and neither the Soviet Union accepted when they invaded Afghanistan, or America when they invaded Panama or some other countries, military dictate. We are interested in a negotiated settlement. We have said that we are ready to implement Security Council resolution concerning all the problems in the Middle East, including the so-called Gulf crisis, including Lebanon, including the Palestinian issue. What's wrong with this? This is not a precondition. This is a call for reason and rationality and justice and fairness. But the United States considers this a precondition. We don't consider that. We are ready to solve the problem in the Gulf, the so-called Kuwaiti question, as long as it's part of a package that would give every party whatever rights they are entitled to under international law.
You're a practical man, Mr. Ambassador. You must recognize that in saying what you're saying, if that reflects the position that Tariq Aziz is taking to Moscow, that the chances of the land war beginning are quite great.
Well, I tell you, I don't think the United States, they might eventually launch a land war, but they would like so far from their strategies to avoid any casualties by concentrating on aerial, heavy, intensive, high-altitude bombardment to Iraq, with the view of really breaking the moral and the military will of the Iraqi population. But I don't know whether there will be a ground war or not. However, if we are attacked, we are ready to defend ourselves.
Now, you wanted to make an observation about the bombing that took place yesterday in Baghdad.
Yes. You know, during the Iraq-Iranian war, I have been to some of the military shelters. They are so sophisticated, so complicated, so well equipped that really it's impossible for an ordinary civilian to live in for 24 hours there. And when I saw that shelter, and I know I'm familiar with the region, it is an area built by the government for the low-income people. It is definitely civilian, and the sign, both in English and Arabic, says that shelter number 25, I believe, and even the guardian or the man in charge of that shelter was a civilian, addressed to civilians, and those who were casualties, children, women, and elderly people, were civilian. So I believe it is an insult to human intelligence, to human decency, for any spokesman in the West here or in the United States to claim that the Iraqis tried to put civilian in this military shelter.
Mr. Ambassador,
they should respect themselves.
We are almost out of time, so to save time, let me just, for the sake of argument, accept the notion that perhaps a mistake might have been made. Clearly, the U.S. government is not acknowledging that, but just for the sake of argument, let's do that for the moment.
It cannot be a mistake, by the way.
At least the U.S. government is taking the position that it regrets the loss of civilian life, that it is taking every possible measure to avoid the loss of human life, and it sounds, if you'll forgive my saying so, rather hypocritical to hear an ambassador from Iraq, which after all has been raining missiles on civilian centers in both Israel and Saudi Arabia, to now shed crocodile tears over the loss of human life in what is, after all, a war.
How candid of you to say hypocritical. How many missiles we have thrown on Saudi Arabia or Israel?
Presumably as many as you were capable of doing.
All right, compared to more than 60,000 sorties from the beginning of the war until now.
You make my point. You make my point, Mr. Ambassador. 60,000 sorties and apparently one accidental bombing of a civilian center.
No, this is not the first one. There's so many, because the very tactic of the American bombardment, namely very intensive, high altitude, by the thousands of tons every day, night and day, that means they cannot actually discriminate between civilian, religious, educational, and military targets.
There is a considerable difference, Mr. Ambassador, between B-52s, which, for example, do engage in carpet bombing in the Kuwaiti theater of operations against military targets, and the kind of smart bombs that are used, which, as you can have seen from the video that you and I have both seen, went right through the roof of that building. I mean, clearly, other buildings in the same region were untouched.
These were mainly British bombs, and this is why they get so many casualties.
No,
they are not B-52.
No, as a matter of fact, it was a stealth bomber, a stealth fighter bomber that came in yesterday.
Bomber, but I'm talking about B-52, where they throw thousands of bombs every day from as high altitude as 34,000 feet. So how can they discriminate between a school, a mosque, or a military establishment?
Because that's precisely the point I'm trying to make, Mr. Ambassador. B-52s are not used against cities. The B-52s are used against military targets in the Kuwaiti theater of operations.
B-52 is used over Baghdad, over Mosul, over Basra, over every town in Iraq.
Mr. Ambassador, thank you for joining us. I appreciate your being here.
That's okay.
When we return, we'll get the view from Capitol Hill as we talk with Senator Christopher Dodd of Connecticut, who lobbied against the use of force in the Gulf, and Senator John McCain of Arizona, a Navy fighter pilot during the Vietnam conflict who was a strong supporter of the president's Persian Gulf policy.
This is the week to buy Sears Easy Living Premium Paint, because during Sears President's Day sale, both satin finish and low luster semi-gloss are at a remarkable price. On sale through President's Day. Only at Sears.
LensCrafters made me these wonderful top-quality glasses and got me back on track in about an hour.
LensCrafters puts the whole lab right in the store to custom craft your top-quality glasses in about an hour. Call LensCrafters at 1-800-522-LENS.
The Japanese do it. The Germans do it. Even Icelanders do it. While others save, America spends. Now Dreyfus says, save America to help save America. Call 1-800-DREYFUS.
We're in luck. Did you know sirloin's only 165 calories and round-tip steaks a mere 157? Where would we be without beef? Out of luck, I'd say. Beef. Real food and luck. Wisconsin.
There are hundreds of bargains at Levitt's Washington's birthday sale. Listen to this. Any size Bassett Posturest Deluxe bedding, only $99.99 each piece. You heard right. Any size, twin, full, queen, or king, only $99.99 each piece. Now that's a bargain.
And only $499.99 buys this reclining sofa. Reclining love seat, only $469.99 now through Monday.
You love it and love it. Don't know why there's no sun up in the sky. Stormy weather.
When the world is looking cloudy, remember, you've got a lot to be thankful for. The Lexus ES250. Come into your Northern California Lexus dealer today. You'll be very grateful tomorrow. Weather's getting worse. I'm cold.
Wells Fargo has a history of coming through with new ideas in banking.
How much? You can have them for $15.
Take a check?
Drawing on Wells Fargo.
We introduced the checking account before most banks had discovered California.
Yep.
After 137 years, our checking accounts are still making history. Wells Fargo comes through again.
Everyone's greatest fear, Saddam's chemical arsenal. This doctor knows its deadly potential firsthand and tells the world what Hussein has. Watch 2020, Friday.
Tomorrow, updates on the Gulf War, plus an interview with former President Jimmy Carter.
Also, Grammy nominee Phil Collins and Caroline Kennedy here on Good Morning America tomorrow.
Joining us now from Phoenix is Senator John McCain of Arizona, one of the few career military veterans in Congress. Senator McCain is a former Navy fighter pilot who was shot down over North Vietnam, spent 5.5 years as a prisoner of war. And joining us from Hartford, Connecticut, Senator Christopher Dodd, a member of the Foreign Relations Committee who initially voted against congressional approval of the use of force in the Gulf, but has since voiced support for the president's decision to go to war. How much of an impact, Senator Dodd, do you think ultimately that bombing in Baghdad yesterday will have?
Well, it depends what geography we're talking about. I think here at home, people respect the fact that our military leaders are doing their very best to avoid those targets. Certainly no one has lost sight of the fact that Saddam Hussein initiated the attack in August and engaged in, according to Amnesty International, incredible violations of human rights. Has a record of it in the past, in the Iran-Iraq War, the treatment, the gassing of Kurds, people in his own population, as you pointed out, the unleashing of Scuds against Israel and Saudi Arabia. This is not a government that has a great deal of credibility when it comes to talking about human rights violations. So I think most people respect the fact we're doing everything possible to avoid those targets here at home, and respect the fact that the military people are regretting deeply what occurred, but are not going to back away from the military mission.
Senator McCain, the Pentagon today obliquely addressed the point of what happens if Saddam Hussein, in fact, deliberately puts civilians in harm's way. And I got the impression that what they were saying is, if they do, that would be terrible, but we're still going to hit the military targets.
I think that's the case, Ted, although perhaps in a hotel where lots of journalists and diplomats are, they may make an exception, but overall the rule has to be that you can't use that kind of a method as sanctuary to protect your military capabilities, because then we pay on the battlefield with U.S. casualties if we don't do everything we can to reduce the enemy's military capacity. And so it's a tough decision, and it's a very difficult one, but clearly I think a correct strategy.
So far, at least, I get the impression that most Americans, certainly many Americans, take the view that it is a tragedy when civilians are killed, and clearly there is a hope that civilians will not be killed in the future, but I don't think there has been any lessening of support for the president's policy thus far. Do you think that the president's policy could sustain many more such accidents, however?
I think they could sustain quite a few, Ted. As you and Chris both mentioned, this guy Saddam Hussein has been able to define himself in the minds of the American people as the brute that he is, and his unspeakable cruelties have made a deep and lasting impression. I think the criteria goes back to what you and I have discussed in the past, and that is the number of casualties in the event of ground operations. I think that's the real criteria. I think the American people, and frankly the Arab people, are sophisticated enough to realize that the United States may make mistakes and tragedies may occur, but we are not like our enemy, who has decided to use destruction and threats of destruction of civilians and incredible damage inflicted on them as an instrument of national policy.
Senator Dodd, the public debate has sort of gone in several phases. First of all, use the economic sanctions. Clearly, that did not work, and the aerial bombardment began. We are now at that next phase. Do you think that a ground war can be, or for that matter, should be avoided?
Well, I think certainly the president would like to avoid it. I think we'd all like to avoid it and have Saddam Hussein leave Kuwait tomorrow, but based on what the ambassador said this evening, I don't think there's any great likelihood of that, and I think a ground war becomes inevitable, but I believe that the administration and our military officials are doing everything possible to minimize the loss of life when that ground war takes place. And I agree with what John has said here. These targets we're hitting are designed to minimize the loss of life when that occurs. My hope would be that we could avoid it, but frankly, I think that's going to be impossible.
Gentlemen, I'm afraid I chewed up some of your time with the Iraqi ambassador, so my apologies to you both, and my thanks for joining us, Senator McCain, Senator Dodd. I'll be back right after this.
So in my interview, they told me how Dow can take all this coal and turn it into clean burning gas.
Wouldn't that cut down on acid rain?
You got it.
Sounds like one serious job, son. I just wish it wasn't so far away.
Gonna miss you, Mike.
Hey, take care of this for me.
You can make a difference in what tomorrow brings.
Son, show 'em what you got.
'Cause Dow lets you do great things.
So what are we hearing now? Wait on airbags for minivans. Nobody puts an airbag in a minivan. It's too tough to engineer them. Well, we did it anyway. No waiting. They're here. Sure, people still have to wear seatbelts with a minivan airbag. So what? Everybody should wear a seatbelt. No, some things you wait for, some things you don't. Minivans with airbags, you don't wait.
Red Devil enamel. You can always count on its durable finish. Harder than ordinary paints, its beauty lasts and lasts. Red Devil enamel for the finish of a lifetime.
Goodfellas, nominated for 6 Academy Awards, including Best Picture, Best Director, Best Supporting Actor and Actress. Goodfellas, 6 Academy Award nominations, including Best Picture. Rated R. Starts Friday, February 15th.
All across America, people are throwing in the towel. The scrub brush, the rubber gloves, and refusing to wash all their dishes before they wash their dishes. They're turning off their faucets and turning on the Maytag Jet Clean dishwasher that scrubs with 47 powerful jets, filters, then disposes. It's made to get dishes clean, no strings attached. Or a repairman. The Jet Clean dishwasher from Maytag, the dependability people.
Tomorrow night, 2020 looks into Saddam Hussein's chemical